As the global environmental crisis continues to threaten our world, with recent alarming events signalling the issue is becoming more serious, the push to achieve a net zero economy has gathered more momentum than ever. This has led to a significant trend in UK businesses adopting a green approach in order to contribute to this national effort. Nevertheless, external and internal factors will affect a company's ability to commit to a sustainable future. In the next half hour, Executive Television explores the challenges and solutions associated with an environmentally conscious ethos, while operating in the modern industrial climate, hearing from 3 companies embracing a green approach.
To help incentivize businesses in the long term, I think we need to start thinking about commercial savings as opposed to just tax implications and massive cost. Tax implications will most likely be put in place, but really to think about how companies can thrive and actually experience growth through the transition is the best way to help companies move towards a net zero future.
We need to see electricity prices being reduced. That's the biggest issue, because when somebody's looking at their financial returns on a heat pump system, they're looking at how much they're spending on gas, and they're going to look at how much they're going to spend on electricity. And although heat pumps have high efficiencies, so their efficiency is greater than 1, it should be up at about 300 or 400%, maybe even 500 or 600% if you're doing cooling. You need to show that the cost savings of running a heat pump are greater than what it would cost you to do business as usual, which is usually gas. Because you've got in the middle, you've got a big capital expense. So you need to see that there's a return on that investment. And right now, with electricity prices being high and being linked to gas, which needs to stop, we're seeing that by switching over to a heat pump, it's still going to cost you a lot of money to run. So what we're suggesting as an association is that we have a heat pump tariff. So if you've got a heat pump, you can access a tariff, an electricity tariff specifically for you. This could also be used on an electric vehicle. So instead of paying 30 pence for electricity, you could be paying 20 pence or less. So that's an instant incentive for people to switch across from using gas onto a heat pump, because they'll instantly benefit from having a cheaper electricity price.
The leverages on industries are twofold. One is from the customer and 2 is from within. If we look at the food industry, for example, the supply chain is being pushed by the supermarkets, who are not necessarily being pushed by the customers. But if we look at within industries, there are staff asking, what are we doing about it? If we look at investment industry, shares in oil and gas companies are under pressure because they're seen as the polluters, and investment is going into those so-called green industries to support that.
It looks like something that's hugely missing if we don't have a documented direction of travel on what we're doing on sustainability. And strategies within the university are incredibly important. Just documenting the way in which we want to go. It's really helpful to get that message across when it's a really large organisation. If we can really clearly show that it's a strategic priority to be more sustainable, then it really helps to create activity across the institution, and there's a kind of snowball effect, or sometimes there'll be a bit of competition between departments trying to prove that they're more sustainable than others. And I think it's also the influence that we might have on the rest of the world. So if Oxford University has got a sustainability strategy with ambitious targets, then I would hope that other people will follow suit.
So the UK government's commitment to net zero by 2050 has had a massive impact on our industry. Firstly, it's enhanced the push towards renewable generation through wind and solar, but it's also brought the possibility of a carbon tax for large energy users. And so this has further enhanced the need to generate on-site renewables and reduce their carbon emissions.
So what does net zero look like for a building? It's really initially defining what net zero is. There's no true one definition because different organisations have different definitions. So the first thing to do is align to a definition. For us, we align with the UK Green Building Council's definition of net zero, which is to operationally be a zero emitter of carbon, or a net zero emitter of carbon. There are other definitions. The utopia definition is you've negated all carbon associated with your building, from its conception to construction, through its lifetime to its demolition. That is a much larger challenge because you have to look back at the embedded carbon of the building as it was created, looking at the life cycle, but also looking at how you deal with the carbon at the end of its life. It's the way we should do it, but we are perhaps too early to get there because it is a significant challenge. For us, concentrating on the now, what can you affect? What's built is built. What you can do is create a net zero operational building. And that is then to ensure that all of the carbon associated with that operation is negated, whether that's negated through energy reduction and the removal of fossil fuels to the possibility of offsetting what you cannot deal with.
The state of current legislation around real estate, in my opinion, is quite poor. We've had energy performance certificates for 17 years, yet they haven't really had an impact on the improvement of property. For us as a business, the period from about 2010 to 2020 found real estate doing a lot of reporting on carbon emissions and energy performance, but no actual improvement. This was a failure of government legislation to drive improvement in the performance of their buildings. Today, we're hitting a target where F&G rated properties will be prohibited to be let. So in 15 years, we haven't made much progress. Yet to achieve net zero within the next 8 to 10 years, we need to get every building in the UK up to an EPC level B. This is a significant challenge for the whole of the industry.
The sector, the industrial sector that I'm in, has been given a boost by the fact the government want to get carbon neutral by 2050. The downside at the moment is that the progress we have to make will be rapid, and we need to invest in training and infrastructure of staff to make sure those people are there, ready to take up the technology as it needs to develop in the next few years.
My view of current space of energy industry is that, considering natural gas prices increasing and the UK is a big user of natural gas, we need to minimize our natural gas usage, especially for electricity generation, because electricity can be generated from renewable sources instead of natural gas.
Government policies and incentives is a key factor in enabling businesses to adopt a green approach. Recently, the British government announced, alongside many other European countries, their commitment to achieve a net zero economy by 2050. This would mean industrial carbon emissions are limited to not exceed the carbon removed from the atmosphere, preventing dangerous global temperature increase.
So what we're lacking from government now is the actual clear plan and the clear steps as to how we take a strategy, which is very high level, and make that into reality for people every day, whether that's a homeowner, a business owner, or a factory. So we are still seeing this very big gap between how much it costs to run a gas boiler, for example, versus how much it costs to run an electric heat pump, which is stopping people when they're looking at the financial model, which at the end of the day is what's really important. How much is this going to cost me? We're still seeing that there's a big difference between the government's strategy and aim and what they're talking about and actually the reality on the ground for real everyday people. So we're still seeing that big gap, and we need government to come to the table, put something in place to make their strategy a reality.
Government support is massively important when it comes to meeting environmental and sustainability targets, particularly when it comes to clarity of policy and understanding what support is in place. As an educational piece, I think it would help to work with businesses to see, particularly from an energy perspective, what green energy transition would be best for them, and the most likely to help them forecast growth, or at least help them stay the same, so that they can see throughout this transition it'll be viable for company survival.
So in the next 5 to 10 years, I see the industry evolving in a number of different ways. The first of those being the development of energy storage methods, So that would be the enhancement of battery energy storage technology, hydro storage, just so we can bridge that gap from going from constant generation to intermittent sources, and basically a bridge so that we can do that. Another key area of development is the different services to support the network, whereas traditionally there was just a market to sell electricity to the network for consumption. There are now new services coming along, and there are those to support inertia and support frequency. So we have many different markets open up in the energy space, not only just to sell power, but to support the network and this transition to renewable generation.
Renewable energy is also susceptible to intermittency issues. Unlike fossil fuels, renewable energy utilizes natural sources such as solar, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal energy, and is heavily dependent on uncontrollable weather conditions. This can cause significant disruption for a business because of limited power availability.
Intermittency is a big problem with renewables, and actually today's electricity price perversely is driven by the gas price, not the intermittency of wind and solar. So around 20 years ago I was involved in the project sat under EDF, who are predominantly a nuclear generator, and they have a very fixed and flat curve of generation. We took a Caribbean island and we put smart meters on this island with the ability to control people's air conditioning, which is effectively an air source heat pump. By having a smart meter, controlling the demand side of it, we were able to cut our generation costs by 60% by simply doing that. Now, the similar technology can be used here. If I go back to an old program on TV, probably in the 80s, 90s, Tomorrow's World, they talked about this new technology, which was a smart meter, which could control the compressor in your fridge or your freezer. Here we are some 30 years later. The smart meters that went in were purely about remotely monitoring your electricity or gas bill. We should actually be able to use these as much smarter equipment. Again, looking at Sweden, they tend to have a 16 amp three-phase supply to each of their properties, and that's not sufficient to run a heat pump, a cooker, a washing machine, a dishwasher, a freezer, a fridge. So they monitor the load on that supply, or the heat pump monitors the load, and it holds itself off for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever's required. And that's not going to affect the heating or hot water in a property.
The barriers for real estate from affecting change for net zero across their portfolios are significant, and a lot of it is structural. The landlord-tenant relationship in buildings means that the savings brought around by investment in infrastructure in the buildings, savings go to tenants in terms of lower energy bills. So landlords investing in their properties don't see any return. So business models need to evolve to try and capture the value of the investment to reduce running costs so that the landlord is incentivized to make those investments. And what we're seeing is different models emerge to enable that to happen. The evolution of digitalization of energy means that you can identify the savings attributed to your interventions. This really helps investors in properties identify what they need to claw back in terms of those savings and what they can pass on to tenants. So it becomes a shared incentive. There is currently, though, an opportunity with EPCs. If legislation coherent with a 2050 net zero target is enforced, the EPC B level by 2030, then that will drive change. However, it does need to be enforced. At the moment, it's unclear as to who is going to enforce the mandatory compliance of buildings to be at EPC level B by 2030.
Advancement in technology has also enabled significant research and development in the renewables sector. Utilizing renewable energy is an effective way for businesses to adopt sustainable practices as well as reducing carbon emissions. However, there are limitations on the feasibility and efficiency of renewable energy for industrial use. As a relatively new and modern concept, there is great uncertainty surrounding the costs associated with renewable energy, and can often be significantly expensive compared to other non-renewable energy sources.
So today, at current electricity and gas prices, you need a heat pump with a coefficient of performance of something like 3.8, which is easily achievable for your running costs or your heating costs to be the same as they are on gas. If you swap the levies over, suddenly gas goes up by 50% and electricity comes down by 40%. Suddenly it's cheaper to run a ground source heat pump, and clients will flock towards it. It is all about how much it costs to run at the end of the day to the person on the street. I think by taking away the cost of the ground collector, using government investment and private money to build communal ground collectors, that halves the cost of a ground source heat pump installation. If we look to manufacturers, if they can build a package box with far more included in it, then there's less on-site installation work, and it very much becomes a box installation, as gas boilers were. Traditionally, gas boilers were a gas boiler and a hot water cylinder. Then it became a combi gas boiler, which is one item in a box. You connect gas up to it, you connect cold water, hot water out, heating flow and return. If we can make a ground source heat pump operate in the same way, so rather than gas, you're connecting up your communal ground collector from the road, then you've got your heating flow and return, hot water, your cold feed and hot water out, and electricity, very similar to a gas boiler. Becomes a very similar way of installing it and a very similar mentality to doing that.
The latest innovative technology can help provide effective solutions to operational issues associated with renewable energy utilization. Smart meter technology and innovative ways of storing excess energy using large batteries or heat pumps have been a result of technological research and development. However, installation and maintenance of these innovative systems can be very costly for businesses and therefore rely on government incentives or PPA, power purchase agreements, with energy companies to make this an economically feasible option.
So one of the methods for reducing your carbon emissions could be through a renewable PPA. There are two common types of renewable PPA. One of them is an on-site development where somebody will fund for the installation of solar or wind on your site. The other type of renewable PPA is where you contract with a large renewable development off-site. Obviously, both of these have great benefits, but they do have negatives and drawbacks. If we just look at the on-site renewable PPA, you do actually have to own your building before you're allowed to install solar panels and wind turbines on your premises. It also could be tricky if you needed to move your premises kind of partway through the term. You'd have to negotiate the terms, negotiate the person that's taken over your premises, taking on that contract. When we look at the off-site renewable PPAs, we've kind of just touched on this a little bit previously. The power is being transmitted long distances to get to you. So you are purchasing that electricity in a renewable form, but there are quite high losses in the lines as that power is transmitted to you. So there is a lot of energy wastage. And furthermore, you are committing to that locked in energy price for quite a long period of time.
Today, we're looking at changing refrigerants. Refrigerants have something called a global warming potential, which is seen as their ability to do harm to the atmosphere. Refrigerants that we've traditionally used for the last 10 to 15 years have a very high global warming potential, and we're now looking at natural refrigerants. With natural refrigerants come issues around explosion proofing, and also they're detrimental to human health. So the onus is on industry and the refrigerant industry to come up with something different. Once they have, the compressor manufacturers will respond to that, and in turn the heat pump manufacturers will respond to that. I see that as the next big leap in heat pump technology. Government currently is probably the biggest fly in the ointment. It's uncertain about current government, current leadership, where we're going with that. The solar industry was nicknamed the solar coaster because policy went up and down. It was here one day and gone the next. With heat pumps, we've seen the RHI for 10 years. That was actually 97%, I think, of that went to biomass and very little to ground source heat pump industry. Hence, it was a poor policy, or it was a good policy, but poor incentives, which misguided the market. The government needs to give clear leadership, clear direction, and then industry and money will follow that because they can see there's a long runway into what we're doing as a business, and therefore will invest and move that forward. The target is 600,000 heat pumps by 2028 being installed. We're a long way off that. If we look at somewhere like Sweden, last year they installed 600,000. We look at Germany, 440,000. I think the UK is currently in the tens of thousands, if that, even with the incentive schemes that we've had. So it's clear policy and an even policy and consistent policy.
If the government is to achieve its net zero economy goal by 2050, It must provide businesses with a realistic strategic framework, as well as financial or regulatory incentives to ensure organisations nationwide are prompted to adopt a green approach.
Investors face another challenge when they come to sell property. If they can't demonstrate how a building will remain compliant in the future to a net zero standard, then they're going to have difficulty either attracting tenants or selling that building to another investor. The way to overcome this is to create a net zero plan in a digital format for a building. We call this the digital twin. This enables an investor or an owner of property to demonstrate to a potential tenant or occupier or a future purchaser how that building will decarbonise over time and remain compliant in a net zero regulatory environment. Another benefit of the digital twin is to capture the interventions made by tenants when they move into buildings. Tenants commonly put forward their proposals when they move into a building for approval by a landlord. These can now be modelled on the digital twin to ensure that the tenant's interventions won't disrupt the pathway that the building is on and its performance to net zero. Often what happens in the past was tenants would move in, retrofit additional air conditioning to buildings, and then energy consumption would go up and it wouldn't be identified. With the digital twin, you can avoid these common mistakes by modelling the tenant's improvements or fit out to the building before you approve it. If you establish that actually their improvements are going to lower performance and impact on the building's journey towards net zero, you can provide positive feedback to the tenant to alter their fit out plans to accommodate their requirements. This is a real benefit of the digital twin going forward, so not only for building sale, but also for supporting tenants and their journey to net zero as well.
There are several pros and cons when it comes to the different green energy options that are available to large energy users or the general consumer. You can switch on to a green energy tariff, which does allow you to sort of pay a higher price in hopes of actually using green energy. Of course, this is more of a paper exercise because it's only when that energy is available. You've effectively paid a higher price. You need energy when you need it, whether or not the wind is blowing. It has to do with the transfer of credits. There are also different renewable PPA options. You have a on-site renewable PPA, which is when a developer will actually come and physically install, say, solar panels onto your roof space, but you still buy the electricity from them. Oftentimes, these contracts can be anywhere from 10 to 25 years because it actually manages the lifespan of the panel installment. And nobody knows what energy prices are going to do. So it's not a fixed tariff. You are using the electricity that you're generating, and there's a positive because there are no transmission losses. But of course, if you do need to supplement that electricity, like if you continue your operations at night and there's no sun, that energy does have to come from somewhere, and it comes from the network. And what that energy is effectively a mixed bag. There's also a corporate PPA, which is an agreement, a contractual agreement with either a large energy buyer or say a wind farm developer. They then use these contracts to be able to go get funding in order to continue to develop their sites. Again, what energy you're actually using when it comes down to it still suffers from transmission losses, so it's not 100% green. And likewise, if the wind isn't blowing and you need electricity, it's most likely not going to come from that wind farm. So there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of how fully green the energy actually is. Alternatively, the fourth option is on-site renewable generation, where you invest in a system for your own green energy. This system does want to be thought through, of course, because depending on your operational needs, you might want a combination of solutions, such as turbines, solar panels, storage systems, hydrogen-powered CHP units. But this would ensure that you have zero transmissional losses. It would effectively take your energy prices down to zero and ensure the security of that price. It can help offset historical carbon usage because energy sustainability is one of the only facets in a carbon audit that you can actually get a negative number, and overall is an investment that will help increase property value as well.
Other barriers to implementing net zero initiatives revolve around the stakeholders within property. Where you have property managers and facilities management companies that aren't necessarily incentivized to keep buildings performing at a net zero level. So what we mean here is we need to look at the contract structure of these other stakeholders to ensure that they are incentivized to keep a building running at a net zero level. Currently, these types of contracts don't exist, but they would improve the market if they're implemented. The risks that investors face to the net zero 2050 target are significant. Long-term investors in property will see buildings' values decline over time unless they invest in those properties to keep them compliant with net zero targets. The amount of money to invest in a building needs to be identified. Lots of these investors borrow money, so banks are also exposed to net zero targets. Lending on property in the UK is significant, and the service of those mortgages and debt is purely through the rent and income that those properties can generate. Legislation will prevent buildings that fail to comply to net zero standards from being leased, thus giving borrowers a real issue in paying back their loans and servicing their debt. This is why banks are very much exposed to net zero regulation in the UK. For me, though, it's an opportunity for the banks to engage with their customers and support them in identifying their net zero strategy for their portfolios. Every asset should have a net zero plan to get it to a net zero standard. This would protect the bank and its lending to the customer, and also gives the bank another opportunity to make finance available for those interventions that can be deployed over a period of time to 2030 and beyond to get an asset to regulatory compliance and net zero standards.
So there are a couple of ways we can ensure there is enough renewable projects to supply everyone with green energy. And the first of which is being the development of technologies. As we develop the turbine and inverter technology, we can get more electricity out of a single piece of land, so we can optimize the land we have available for generating that green energy. The other link is on storage, as we've already discussed. The wind's not always blowing, the sun's not always shining, so it's important that we have that crucial link so that we can store electricity when we have a surplus of generation that can be used when it's needed for the high levels of demand. Finally, if you're a big energy user, you have the ability to invest in your own on-site renewable development. It's not only the most responsible thing to do, but it also makes commercial sense for planning for your future business needs.
As the environmental agenda becomes increasingly more prominent in the business world, it will be interesting to discover how the green transition will develop as organizations strive to make the process as efficient and sustainable as possible. There is no doubt innovative technology and advancements made through research and development into the renewable sector will play a crucial role in achieving this. As the current economic climate continues to strain UK businesses' resources, the government must provide enhanced support with a green transition if they are to reach their target of net zero economy by 2050, as well as enabling the reduction of industrial carbon emissions and operational sustainability to be rapidly accelerated on a national scale.